Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining me today for the fourth episode of WTF Science and Beyond. Each episode will discuss a dark, funny, or completely botched science experiment, a newsworthy sciencey story, or anything else that makes you ask, what the fuck is going on? I'm your host, Lady Ayla Nicole. Now let's get into it. Last year, my child came to me and said, I want to befriend a crow. I was intrigued. My child is extremely intelligent, and so I knew there must really be something to this idea. So I asked why. And the simple reason is, if you're an animal lover, it's because it's fun and rewarding, and for some of us, essential. We get dogs and cats and rats and rabbits. We love them, and they love us. But there is something so spectacular about an animal that doesn't need you, that chooses to love you. And by that I mean an animal that doesn't need you. They live in the wild, they take care of themselves, and yet they continue to come around if they like you. You might think that all of the things we're going to discuss are just for survival, and obviously they are, but maybe it's not just for survival. Maybe they really love being friends with humans. They aren't completely dependent on us for food or shelter. They have plenty of other crows for company and community. But what if the similarities in our brains have made us perfect allies? Let's talk about it and see what you think. Crows have a special intelligence. It's not like we don't know that animals can be highly intelligent, but we usually don't assign this type of intelligence to birds. I know I certainly had no idea prior to this. But crows can recognize and remember human faces for years, and they can tell good people from bad people. They may bring you gifts. Some things that crows have been reported to bring are keys, earrings, bones, rocks, peanuts, moss-covered sticks, shiny foil, pebbles, small pieces of brown glass, and beads. I find it interesting that they will bring human things, like the earrings or the beads. Maybe it's just that they like shiny things, or maybe they understand that these things belong to humans. If you have a cat or a dog, you know that it may bring you presents sometimes. I have a cat that will bring us socks. He steals everybody's socks and brings them and drops them in front of us. It's actually very funny because he like meows while he's carrying it. But again, something about a crow doing this is different. Other things crows will do to show their affection is to approach you closely, mimic human voices, respond to their names, and even defend their familiar humans. They'll defend their familiar humans from potential threats. If a crow finds you to be friendly, they will communicate this to their pals. So if you have one crow friend, you could have many crow friends. You could have an army of birds on your side. A group of crows is called a murder, and they can gather in the hundreds. So as you can see in their natural habitat, we've observed the intelligence of crows. But let's talk about some controlled experiments that indicate what these creatures can really do. I like to call this part, Are You Smarter Than a Second Grader? I don't know if you remember that show. I think it was, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? But in this, we're going to ask, are you smarter than a second grader? Now, we're going to be discussing the concept of zero, and the concept of zero as used in a number system fully developed in human society around the 5th century AD, or perhaps a few centuries earlier. For instance, the notion of multiplying 8 by 0 or adding 0 to 10 didn't emerge until then. The concept of none, or the absence of any quantity, likely emerged earlier, but this differs from using 0 as a distinct quantity in and of itself. We understand and teach this concept now, but it wasn't always the case. If you asked mathematicians, most of them will probably tell you that the discovery of 0 was a mind-blowing achievement. The special thing about 0 is that it doesn't fit into a routine of counting real objects as with actual numbers. In other words, someone can count 3 apples placed in a basket, 1, 2, 3. But when the basket is empty, There aren't any apples to count. 0 represents that emptiness, and that requires very abstract thinking. Thinking that is detached from anything we can observe. And now this study has proven that a crow's neurons encode 0 as they do other numbers. A neuron is a type of cell that receives and sends messages from the body to the brain and back to the body. The bird's brain activity patterns also support the idea that 0 falls before 1 on crow's mental number line. So if you are my age, think of those banners that used to hang over the chalkboard in elementary school that had the numbers 0 to 10. It included 0 as the first value. Little did we know that they were teaching us to be as smart as crows. In this new study published June 2nd of this year, the Journal of Neuroscience, the group ran experiments with 2 male carrion crows. The birds sat on a perch and were trained to interact with a computer monitor in front of them. In each trial, a gray screen displaying 0 to 4 black dots popped up in front of the crows. This first image was followed by a second image containing either the same or a different number of dots. And then the crows were trained to peck at the screen or move their heads if the two images matched one another, and to remain still if they did not match. In a previous study using the same setup, the crows could successfully identify the matched and unmatched pairs of images about 75% of the time. And this previous study did not include an empty screen, standing in for 0, but it did demonstrate that the crows could differentiate an image containing 3 dots from a screen containing 5. So the greater the difference between the two sets of dots, the more accurately the birds responded. In other words, these crows had more difficulty distinguishing closer quantities such as 2 and 3 more often than quantities that were further apart such as 1 and 4. This is called the numerical distance effect, and monkeys and humans can also understand this concept. In this recent study, they included a blank screen, and they found that the crows could discriminate 0 from the other countable numbers. So the important part is that the birds still demonstrated the numerical distance effects in trials that included the empty screen. This means that the birds mixed up the 0 dot image with the 1 dot image more often than the 2, 3, and 4 dot images. So this means that they treat the empty set not just as nothing versus something, but really as a numerical quantity, in that they perceive 0 dots as proximal to 1 dot. In order to understand how their brains were working during the experiment, tiny electrodes were placed into the crows' brains. And what the team found was that specific subgroups of neurons became active for certain numbers. And interestingly, the greater the distance between that preferred number and the number of on-screen dots, the less active those neurons became. So in the numbers that they were having no problems identifying, so 1 and 5 was no problem for them, and those neurons were not firing off as hard because they weren't working as hard. That's how I understood that. So back to these patterns of brain activity hinted at how the crows perceived numerical values in relation to each other. They are inherently representing this ordering along a number line. After 1 comes 2, and after 2 comes 3, etc. In the new study, the team repeated this experiment with the addition of the 0 dot screen. In all, they took recordings from more than 500 neurons between the two crows. And as before, they found that different subsets of neurons lit up in response to different numbers of dots, But in addition, another subset fired in response to the blank screen. This means that they saw that 0 on the number banner. Those neurons became less and less active the more dots popped up on screen, or the further from 0 the number grew, right? Because they don't have a problem with those. When we consider the observed patterns of behavior and brain activity, this suggests that crows do indeed grasp the concept of 0. How the crows use this information, we don't know. While being able to distinguish one piece of fruit from two can be useful for survival, I don't see an immediate advantage for these animals to understand nothing as a quantity, one of the neuroscientists noted. Maybe in the wild they don't use this ability, but only demonstrate it because they were presented with this task. But the fact remains that it's incredible that their brains are wired in such a way that they can learn to understand 0 as a quantity. And that was a lot. Now let's move on to some experiments that are a little simpler, so to speak. And all of these experiments I'll explain just in brief. If you're interested, you can go and look up some of these videos for yourself, or some of these experiments for yourself. There's a lot of great websites and YouTube videos. 5 out of 5, highly recommend. But this will give you a good jumping off point to see if you're really interested in looking up further. I spent hours watching crow videos. It was really quite fascinating. And obviously, that's why we're here. So the first experiment we're going to talk about, or the first not so heavy experiment, involves 8 New Caledonian crows and their ability to create tools by combining 2 or more elements. So the researchers in this study presented the crows with a clear puzzle box that they had never encountered before, and it contained a small food container behind a door, and at the bottom of the door was a narrow gap. In the first part of this experiment, the scientists left some sticks that were long enough to reach the food scattered around, and all the birds grabbed one, picked one up, and inserted it through the front gap and pushed the food to an opening on the side of the box in no time. They barely had to think about it. Next, the scientists left the food deep inside the box, but provided pieces that were not long enough to reach the food. These short pieces could potentially be combined with each other, as some were hollow and others could fit inside them, like the hose attachments on a vacuum. Without any help from the researchers, 4 of the crows partially inserted one piece into another and used the longer pole to reach and extract the food. The scientists then made the task more difficult by supplying even shorter combinable parts, and found that one particular bird named Mango was able to make compound tools out of 3 or even 4 parts. Up until this point, this ability had been observed only in humans and great apes. Human children can demonstrate this ability to choose the right tool, say a hook over a pipe cleaner, to reach and bring an object to them by the age of 4. But they didn't develop the ability to combine parts to make a tool without demonstration until the age of 8. Next, there were a series of experiments in which crows displayed an understanding of water displacement. Water displacement is the act of moving water out of the way by placing objects in it to make the water rise to the surface of its container. And the volume of water displaced by an object is equal to the volume of the object itself. In the first task, the crows were presented with 2 vials and some rocks. One vial contained water and the other contained sand. Both vials contained a bit of food that were just out of reach. The crows were able to put rocks into the vial of water, bringing the water level up high enough so they could retrieve the treat, and they completely ignored the vial of sand. The next experiment is light versus heavy. The crow was again presented with a vial of water and a bit of food just out of reach. There was a selection of light and heavy pieces that looked like plastic, and the crow then chose only the pieces that would sink in the water in order to make it rise. Next is hollow versus solid. This time, the crow was given a set of two types of pieces of what look like metal. It is clear to see by looking at them which is solid and which is hollow. And as you can probably guess, the crow chose the solid pieces to again raise the water to get the treat. Next, the crow was presented with two vials and the square pieces. One vial had a higher water level. The crow chose the vial with more water to drop the pieces into because they understood that one vial of water would be less work than the other vial. Human children can learn to understand water displacement by the ages of 7 to 10. In 2012, the University of Cambridge researchers found that children ages 7 to 10 could learn to drop stones into a tube to raise the water level and get a reward. Children ages 4 to 6 were unable to learn this process. Now, these are pretty impressive results if you ask me. These are what I think of as practical skills, but what about social skills? American crows are highly social birds, more often seen in groups than alone. In addition to roosting and foraging in numbers, crows often stay together in year-round family groups that consist of the breeding pair and offspring from the past 2 years. When new babies are born, the older siblings will help care for them. So in this way, crows are able to pass on knowledge to their young quite easily. And the more you hang out with your parents, the more they will teach you. And if any of you have come from a big family, you understand that all your older siblings teach you things as well, and some more mischievous than others. Studies have been done to prove the crow's ability to recognize individual facial characteristics. One such study involved two groups of people wearing two different sets of masks. One group sent out to trap a group of crows while the other walked around the crows without trying to interact with them at all. 5 years later, the same groups went out into the same park. The group that had trapped crows previously got mobbed by an angry flock, while the other group that did not interact with the birds was left completely alone. This study proved that the birds not only recognized and reacted to the group that had previously caused them stress, but had also passed this information down to their young and onto the other crows living in the park. 5 years is a crazy amount of time for a bird to recognize a face. Crows have even been known to hold a funeral of sorts, although whether it's an evolutionary lesson on how to recognize danger or an emotional response is up for debate, but I think it can be both. Crows have been observed dropping nuts on the road so that cars can run them over and crack them. They can also memorize restaurant schedules and garbage days to take advantage of scavenging times. But by this point, you may be asking, Lady Nicole, why are crows so smart? Now we come to the anatomy part of the podcast. So the studies we discussed show that crows think it over. This ability to consciously assess a problem is associated with the cerebral cortex in the brains of humans. The cerebral cortex is the gray matter that covers the brain's outermost surface. It's made up of tightly packed neurons that form a complex association. The cortex is about 2 to 4 millimeters thick and makes up about 40% of the brain's mass. But birds have no cerebral cortex. In crows, thinking occurs in the pallium, and that is the layers of gray and white matter covering the upper surface of the cerebrum in vertebrates. Your cerebrum is the largest part of your brain and handles conscious thoughts and actions. Other studies support the notion that the bird brain can, in principle, support the development of higher intelligence. This idea has been dismissed in the past due to the small size of birds' brains, but recent research has shown that in birds, the neurons are smaller and more tightly packed, which makes sense to reduce weight and make it easier to fly. So the total number of neurons in crows, which is about 1.5 billion, is about the same as in some monkey species. But because they are more tightly packed, communication between the neurons seems to be better, and the overall intelligence of crows may be closer to that of a gorilla. So the next time someone calls you a bird brain, take it as a compliment. And all this is very clinical, and you know how I love clinical, but I also love personal experience. So, back to our original question, why befriend a crow? To answer this, I think we only need to look at some personal stories of people who have done just that. So, part of the first story is written by a woman on I believe it was Live Science was the site. And part of the story, the lady says, my mom, who cannot manage to imitate an adult crow call, would give the baby crow feed me call when she put all the food out to get their attention. Eventually, the adult crows also started to use this call, so there's probably an entire clan of crows out there that still communicate exclusively in baby talk. Another woman leaves out food for her neighborhood crows in Seattle, and in return, they leave her gifts like shiny baubles and a chapstick tube. The crows even returned a lens cap that she lost while taking photos of birds in an alleyway. So that's pretty cool. Like, they saw her drop it and they knew it was hers and brought it back to her thinking that she might need it again. I love that. So she treasures all of these little gifts that her crows bring her. And when the BBC did an article about her crows, she told the reporter, you may take a few close looks, but don't touch. Another person befriends crows in Portland by feeding them, and by suggestions from the Audubon Society, her neighbors all feed them. They all feed them too. And during a snowstorm, the crows made a ruckus when one of their elderly neighbors fell in her driveway, alerting their human flock. The woman was then able to receive help from one of her neighbors, a sort of 911 bird call. And this last one I really love. It's not so much about a woman interacting with the crows as just observing these crows that she has visit her yard. So she has two crows, male and female, and they come to her yard every day. And she would set up different puzzles for them to get morsels of food, mental stimulation. So one day the female had found a pebble and was playing with it, but the male came up and put his foot on the pebble, like he stole it from her and wouldn't let her have it back. But this was no submissive crow. She walked several steps away and began looking around and then pretended to observe something very fascinating. The male became curious and came over to see what all the fuss was about. And as soon as he was far enough away from their stone, she ran and reclaimed it. And now that we know why to befriend a crow, let's talk about how to befriend a crow. The process itself is quite easy. The hardest thing is having patience. I know that I tend to want more immediate results with things, but this isn't going to get you anywhere with crows. So the first thing you need to do is look out for crows. Obvious, right? Quietly observe your yard, your neighborhood, or a nearby park. Crows will live where people live, so there's a high probability that there are already some very near. Next, offer food. They will eat all kinds of things, insects, nuts, fruit, and even meat. If possible, offer it at the same time in the same place every day. Establish a routine. Be careful not to overfeed. You don't want a crow to become reliant on you. He still needs to be able to find food for himself. A few shelled peanuts or a couple pieces of dog kibble are enough. They also need water to dip their food in. Sometimes it's better to just put out a small bowl. I wouldn't mind having a bird bath large enough for a party, but if you live in an apartment or don't have a large yard, you might want to keep the party a little more intimate. If a crow begins to accept your offerings, be mindful. He is a wild animal. Observe his behavior. If he seems anxious, avert your gaze. Don't try to get too close. Let him come to you. Sit quietly and still. Avoid quick movements. Let him get used to you being there. Give your crow time to get to know you. He might be shy at first, but he is watching you very closely, and he will remember your face and remember your kindness. Talk to them. They like it. Maybe make the same sound every day when you put out their treats. A couple of the articles I read say that a crow will never get more than a few feet from you or eat out of your hand. But then I saw a couple of videos on YouTube where crows were eating from someone's hand or off of their arm. So maybe it's possible. You'll just have to find out. Also, some articles state that a crow won't come to a yard with a dog or cats. I have a Chihuahua that, that's not much of a threat aside from it being loud. But both of our neighbors have large dogs, so I decided against it. But after researching this, maybe I'll have to give it another shot because all of this sounds amazing. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Thank you all for being here. If you listen to my second episode, you remember that I would not be here without my dear friend, the Odd Witch. Tara's superhero power is helping you to cast the life you desire by empowering you to be truly alive. So head over to Odd Witch Radio and show her some love. That's Odd Witch Radio here on Spotify. I will link it in the description for this episode. If you're digging the podcast, please hit the bell notification and give the show a 5-star review. It really helps out the podcast. Feel free to leave me a suggestion in the comments for whatever you want to hear next. And with that, this is Lady Ayla Nicole signing off. And remember, kids, don't try this at home. Bye.